like to start in Proverbs chapter 25 and in verse 2, because this is a verse that um, we have to take it seriously, even for people that have busy lives that don't really have the time to work out difficult solutions. You know, if you have the right tools, then you can get to where you want to go in the Word and the level of understanding you want. And different people want different levels of understanding. Some people want the big picture. That's all they need. Some people want to really understand the little nuances and how this fits with that. So in Proverbs 25, verse 2, it says, it's the glory of God to conceal a matter. And that's, when you're studying the Bible, that's pretty maddening because you're like, God, I wish you didn't conceal it so well. And there's a lot of interesting things that are concealed. Actually, I ran into one. Bill Schlegel and I are in Leviticus, so we're in Leviticus today. And over the weekend, I was studying in Leviticus, and I ran into something that I never noticed before. It's been there all the time, but I just never noticed it. And that is, most of you are aware of the sacrifice of the red heifer, and the red heifer symbolizes Christ. And the red heifer was burned into ashes, and then those ashes are mixed with water, and then that water is sprinkled on unclean people, and then there's a process to it, but then they are clean in the eyes of God. Well, what I never noticed is the priest that killed the red heifer became unclean by his contact with it. And then the people that took the pieces of the red heifer and burned the red heifer, they became unclean by their contact with it. But then when you sprinkle the person who was unclean, they became clean. And I thought, boy, if that isn't, what an interesting picture of Jesus Christ. That here you have Jesus Christ, and the people that mishandle him, that slaughtered him, if you will, that burned him to ashes, if you will, those people are rejected and become unclean. But the sinners and the people that the red heifer gets to sprinkle, they become clean. And I thought, wow, what an interesting paradox. And that's just the kind of thing that's buried in the word there. And here it says, it's the glory of God to conceal a matter, and we have to understand that. Another thing, especially when we're working the four gospels, is we have to be aware of the fact that we almost have to paste the gospels back together. The records are they're in the various gospels, but they're not necessarily in a way that's laid out. That you have to pay attention to the four gospels and the verbiage, what's said, that kind of thing, and then you can put the record back together. So, for example, if you look at Isaiah chapter 61, in verse 1, it says, "The Spirit of the Lord Yahweh is upon me," talking about the Messiah, "because Yahweh has anointed me to preach the good news to the humble. He has sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to the captives and release to those who are bound, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor, of Yahweh's favor, and the day of vengeance of our God." And when we read that, you think, okay, when the Messiah comes, this is where the Jews were, and many of them are today. When the Messiah comes, he's going to proclaim the year of Yahweh's favor, and he's going to bring vengeance upon God's enemies. We believe this prophecy is going to come to pass, but we also believe that between the first phrase, proclaiming the year of Yahweh's favor, and the second phrase, the day of vengeance of our God, is been about 2,000 years, and we don't know how many more years we have to go. So, but if you were just reading this straight through, you wouldn't know that. And it's kind of that way. In fact, it is. It's very much that way with the record of the Gospels. So that having been said, what I'd like to do is share my screen and work with you through some of the days of Jesus Christ. So I'm going to go down here to share. And I think this is it. And if I'm on the right, what happened? Okay. If I'm on the right screen, can you see my cursor now?
We can.
Yep.
Okay, good deal. So this is the last days of Jesus Christ and his resurrection. And I've used JT for Jewish time and RT for Roman time, which is the same as Western time. The Roman clock reset at midnight. That's actually where we get our clock. We get our modern clock, which resets at midnight directly from the Roman world. The Jews had a better system. They reset at sundown. When the sun went down, that started the new day. So if we start with Jesus Christ, and I want to, you may need to do this just kind of to, if you want to follow along a little easier. Let me. I know that. Oh, there it is. I'm going to stop sharing this screen, and there may be a way that I can hop from screen to screen. I don't know, but I'm going to share this screen a second. Can you see this screen?
Yes.
Where my cursor is? Good. Then if you see the way this is laid out, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday. If I'd had more, I would have liked to have gone back into the past and done Sunday, Saturday, Friday, Thursday, and that's something you can do based on where we're going in this. I'm going to stop sharing this screen, and I'm going to go back to sharing this screen. And so here we are. We're on Thursday at this point, and this is the Thursday previous to the Wednesday where Christ is going to be crucified. So we've got the activities of Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday. Monday, Christ is arrested. Tuesday, Christ goes through the trials, and then he's handed to the soldiers. Wednesday, he's crucified. So this is a week before Christ is crucified, and Jesus arrives in Bethany from Jericho, and John 12:1 gives us chronology. And this is one of the things that I'm kind of astounded about, because the chronology is laid out here in the Bible, and yet for the most part, because it doesn't fit with the narrative, the standard church narrative, the church has basically ignored it. Here it says specifically this is 6 days before Passover. And so Christ arrives in Bethany. Now he came from Jericho. That's where he was with Zacchaeus. That was where he healed the blind man who said, "Son of David, or actually true blind man, Son of David, have mercy on us." So he healed the blind men. He ate with Zacchaeus, the tax collector. And then he comes up from Jericho and arrives in Bethany. And Bethany is on the east side of the Mount of Olives. So if you're looking at from the temple and you're looking east at the Mount of Olives, you can't see Bethany. Bethany's just over the crest of the Mount of Olives. So Jesus arrives in Bethany. This is 6 days before the Passover. And if he left Jericho, and it's like quite a long walk, about 15-mile walk, basically almost entirely uphill. So you're going to go slow. It's going to be an arduous walk. So by the time he gets there, he's going to be hungry. His disciples, apostles, are going to be hungry. So they have the supper in Bethany. And this is when Mary, and this would be Mary of Mary and Martha. Remember that they would stay in the home of Lazarus. He must have been fairly wealthy. He must have had a fairly large home. The gospel indicates that Mary and Martha were there as well. So Mary anoints Jesus with the expensive oil, and that is when Judas Iscariot got all upset and said, "Why was this waste of oil made?" And so this is going on Thursday. And then we pay attention to the chronology. And to pay attention to the chronology, you have to understand the various, that a chronological key generally appears in one gospel or two gospels at the most, but not all four. So that's part of the reason for fitting the whole record together, is you find out where the chronological keys are. So this is now going to be Friday, Nisan 9. And John 12:12 says it's the next day. And if you read the Gospel of John and the flow of Gospel of John, you have the events that show that are similar to what we just read on Nisan 8. But then John 12:12 starts out the next day. So you're like, okay, I got it. I know where I am. So now we're on Friday, and it's the next day. And then Jesus sends his disciples to get a donkey. And then you get the references there, Matthew, Mark, Luke. It's not in the Gospel of John. And I'm sure most of you are very familiar with the record. Christ sends his disciples into town to get a donkey. And he says, you'll find a colt, no person's ridden on it. It's tied up. You'll start to take it away. And if anybody challenges you, say the Lord has need of it, which of course, as soon as they start walking off with the donkey, somebody says, hey, what are you doing? And they say the Lord has need of it. And that was the end of it. And then you have the triumphal entry. And the triumphal entry is in all four Gospels. It's one of the events in the Gospel record that's in all four Gospels. And the triumphal entry is a huge deal, and it's the fulfillment of Zechariah 9:9. So if we want to take a look at Zechariah 9:9, I am going to shift screens here a little bit, and let's go to Zechariah chapter 9, verse 9. And it says, rejoice greatly, daughter Zion. Shout, daughter Jerusalem. Behold, your king comes to you. He is righteous and having salvation. And by the way, having salvation, the word Hosanna, when the crowds are shouting Hosanna, the basic meaning of Hosanna is save us. And even the little children were yelling, Hosanna to the Son of David. And the Pharisees came along and said, make the children shut up, And Christ is like, no, if they were to shut up, the rocks themselves would cry out. So if you wonder, where does Hosanna come from? Why would anybody be saying, Hosanna, save us? Because here was the prophecy. When the king comes, he's righteous and he has salvation. And that's what they were all looking for. Today, you and I are looking forward to the hope. We want the hope of Christ's return. They were looking for salvation for the Romans. And here's this prophecy that says he's righteous, he's having salvation, he's lowly and riding on a donkey, even on a colt, the foal of a donkey. And then what is he going? And of course he did that, but then the Bible continues, Zechariah chapter 9, verse 10, I will cut off the chariot from Ephraim, the war horse from Jerusalem, the battle bow will be cut off. He will speak peace to the nations. In other words, and his dominion will be from sea to sea, from the river to the ends of the earth. This is Christ's reign over the entire earth. And once again, we get the first part of the prophecy fulfilled in verse 9, even though the prophecy flows seemingly seamlessly to verse 10, that still has not been fulfilled yet. So anyway, so that's Friday. He just walks in and he looks around and leaves, goes back to Bethany. And then again, a chronological key in Mark chapter 11, verse 12, and on the next day. Now, on the next day, then, and one of the things that happens when we put this together is we can see lessons that otherwise didn't pop out. Most of us are familiar with the record where Jesus curses a fig tree on one day, and then the next day, they're walking in and say that the fig tree you cursed has withered away. And so that's what this is. Jesus is going into Jerusalem, and Mark contains the record. Jesus curses this fig tree, and it's just a curse. He speaks it over the tree, and then, okay, then in the culture, people would understand the fig tree is supposed to represent Israel, but he cursed the fig tree and just moves on. Then also on Saturday, then he goes to Jerusalem. Now on Friday, he just looked around. Now on Saturday, he cleanses the temple. So on on Friday, he just did a reconnoiter, got an idea who's doing what where, what's going on. So on Saturday, when he shows up, he cleanses the temple and hear the children crying, Hosanna, and then a voice from heaven that God will glorify, that God had and will glorify his son. And the context of that voice is really important. And you can see the context here in John 12, 27 to 33 is the context of the voice and Jesus Christ and what he's saying. And what he's speaking about is his death. And if you remember from Exodus chapter 12, let's go back to Exodus chapter 12. And in Exodus chapter 12, verse 1, Yahweh spoke to Moses and Aaron. Verse 2, this month is the beginning of months for you. By the way, that's going to come up later. So that's a very important chronological point to pay attention to. This month is the beginning of months. It is the first month of the year for you. Speak to the congregation, verse 3, of Israel and say, on the 10th of this month, everyone among you or among them must take a lamb according to their father's houses. So a lamb per household. So it was on the 10th of the month of Nisan that the Passover lamb was chosen out of all the various sheep and goats. Remember, it could be a Passover lamb. It could also be a Passover goat. So out of all their flocks and herds, it was on the 10th of the month that the head of the household, or he went out with his family, and they chose the lamb or the goat that was to be a Passover animal. So here's God, and it would be then his job to choose the son, which he does in a very powerful way as Jesus Christ is talking about his death. Here comes this voice from heaven that God had and will glorify his son. And as far as we have been able to determine, then this is the point at which God chose his son absolutely to where people hear it, because this voice that came from heaven, people heard it. Now they couldn't quite make out what God said. Some people even said it thundered, but everybody heard the voice. And it clearly picked out Jesus Christ. So this is God fulfilling what needed to happen according to Exodus 12, and it's happening with Jesus Christ on this Saturday, the 10th of Nisan. And Jesus is speaking about his death, and then the Bible tells us that Jesus goes back to Bethany for the night, and that is in Matthew and Mark. So then we get to Sunday, and on Sunday, Jesus gets up in the morning. He goes back to Jerusalem again. That record's in Matthew and Mark. Then Jesus and the disciples see the fig tree dried up. And I think we remember it was, Master, look, the fig tree you cursed is withered away. And Jesus's response somewhere in the context of that was to curse another fig tree that died immediately. And that's in Matthew chapter 21. And if you're not putting the days together, then you don't notice that the same day they saw the cursed fig tree all dried up was the same day that Christ cursed a fig tree right then and there, and it dried up immediately. And if you understand that the fig tree was a symbol of Israel and supposedly the bounty of Israel, and it had dried up, basically died, that anything spoken twice was established. If you remember, a prophetic picture given twice is established. And so this is basically Christ, who knew by this time that he was going to die. The Jews were going to reject him. He kind of knew he was going to die anyway from the prophecies, even though he said, Father, if there's any way for this not to happen. But by this time, it was abundantly clear that the Jews were not going to believe in Christ. They were going to be rejected. And of course, then their nation would dry up, which in fact it did. So this is the two times that they see the cursed fig tree and Jesus Christ curses a fig tree. Then He goes into the temple and he teaches in the temple. And if you follow the reason, it'll say Matthew 21:23 FF, Mark 11:27 FF, Luke 19:47 FF. This is a long teaching. If you this teaching takes up chapters and chapters in all four of the Gospels. And so that becomes pretty important to follow because you can lose track of where you are. Jesus, it's one of those things when you get into multi-chapter teachings, then your mind kind of wanders. Was he in Galilee? What was he in? Where is he? All this time, all of those teachings, Jesus is in the last week of his life inside the temple, and he does all that teaching. So all the people that are there and starting to gather for Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread, all of those people are going to be able to hear that long teaching and dissertation by Jesus. And then that's when the disciples, Matthew chapter 24, Mark 13, Luke 21, the disciples take Jesus and say, so what is the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? And then you get the double chapter teaching, Matthew 24 and 25, and again, Mark 13, Luke 21. And we get, this wonderful teaching about the end times and what to look out for. So he does that teaching. And then he goes back to Bethany, and we see that in Matthew 26:60. And then we note that now Jesus is anointed by a second woman. Now, the second woman is not named, but she does basically exactly what Mary had done the first time, anoints Jesus with an expensive ointment. And so in the same way that you have two fig trees that were cursed, you have Jesus anointed for his burial two different times. And so there's an emphasis here about what God is putting his stamp of approval on, what we're going to see develop historically. So then we go to the next day, Monday. And so this is it's used idiomatically. It's stated in all three Gospels that this is the first day of unleavened bread. If we didn't know the cultural implication and didn't know the idiom, we would think that this was the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread that's mentioned in the Torah, which goes along with the Feast of Unleavened Bread, then the Feast of Pentecost, then the Feast of Tabernacles. But Jesus Christ hadn't even died yet. The Passover lamb hadn't been slain yet. What's going on? How can it be the first of the unleavened bread? You got to have the Passover first, and then then the Feast of Unleavened Bread comes. And the answer is that they use that kind of like we talk about Christmas time. And sometimes we might say, well, it's Christmas time. And sometimes we might just say, well, it's Christmas. And we mean the same thing. It becomes an idiom in the culture. And the scholars thankfully recognize that. So it's the first day of unleavened bread, meaning it's the first day when the season begins to get really serious. We're going to do the preparation. And of course, then that's when on this Monday you have the Last Supper. And the Last Supper is going to start before sunset. So it starts on Monday, but it ends Jewish time on Tuesday. So the Last Supper goes from Monday to Tuesday, or if you're using Roman time, which would be our Western time, the Last Supper started on Monday and ended on Monday. And if you read the records of the Last Supper, which are fairly long, the different like for example, the Last Supper in the Gospel of John takes up 4 entire chapters. So there's a lot of scripture that's involved in the Last Supper. And in the middle of the Last Supper, the Lord's Supper was instituted with bread and wine. And we're familiar with that. We just had communion on Sunday with the bread and the wine. And then I broke it up because Nisan 12 is Monday, and then Nisan 13 starts or Tuesday. They're still in the Last Supper, but now you have a different series of events. So Judas leaves the Last Supper and he's going to go round up the chief priests, and they're going to get the Roman army to come to arrest Christ, which they do later. Then Jesus and the disciples leave the upper room, go to the Garden of Gethsemane, and that's laid out beautifully in the various Gospels. And you can see the chronology there in John 18:1. John 8, if again, these little chronological keys, if we didn't have John 18:1, we would have a confusing picture about when the Last Supper ended. John's prayer in John chapter, or Jesus's prayer in John 17 and the Garden of Gethsemane, and how that would fit and how the chronology would work. But John 18:1 straightens it all out. Then you can put it together. And then Jesus goes to the Garden of Gethsemane, and then he prays in the Garden of Gethsemane. That is not his prayer in John 17. John chapter 17 is a huge prayer of Jesus Christ, but it was done with the apostles as a closing, if you will, and almost closing to the Last Supper. The prayer in the Garden of Gethsemane is a totally different ballgame. Here, Jesus Christ is praying for strength. He's praying for perseverance. He asks God if he actually has to go through this. He's so focused that he's just amazingly focused here. So this is the prayer in the Garden of Gethsemane. And then we have, of course, Judas shows up and betrays Jesus Christ. And then we have now a whole series that begins after Christ's arrest. You have him taken to Annas, one of the high priests, and this would be fairly late at night. And so what's going to happen here is, again, the Roman time is going to shift at midnight. And so it goes from Monday Roman time, Nisan 13, to Tuesday Roman time, Nisan 13. So this is likely after midnight, and Jesus is sent from Annas to Caiaphas. Then you have this whole trial of Jesus before Caiaphas, and it's when Jesus is before Caiaphas that Peter is in the courtyard, and you have three events with Peter. He has an event at the gate where he's challenged and he has to deny Christ, and then he goes over to the fire pit and he's warming himself and he gets challenged and he denies Christ there, and he goes back to the gate and he's there at the gate and he gets challenged for a third time by different people. And then it's at that point that they're moving Jesus from one place to another, and Jesus catches his eye, and then Peter is really broken and goes out, and it says he wept bitterly. So they keep Jesus up all night, and this would be then our Tuesday, our early morning, if you will. So Jesus is before Caiaphas, and then in the morning, and because again, their Tuesday started at midnight. So in the morning, Jesus was taken before the whole Jewish Sanhedrin. And thankfully, that's one of the things that's really clear in the scripture. When you look at Matthew 27:2, Mark 15:1, Luke 22:66 to 23:1, the fact that Jesus is before the whole Jewish Sanhedrin, and it's not Caiaphas's trial. That becomes very clear, and that's an important thing, because it puts in perspective both the illegal work that they did to Christ, and then getting the whole group together and trying Christ again. And that's going to be another reason that's going to be important, is because after that trial, when those men then condemned Christ and took him to Pilate, they all left. And that's important. They scattered, they went to wherever they went, their homes or jobs in the temple or whatever. And that becomes very important, because at the first trial, they had to be gathered up and brought together by the Jews. But for the second trial, they had to be gathered up a second time. And that becomes clear in the text. And that's one of the ways that you can tell what's going on, which trial is which. So you have verse, the next dot, where Jesus is before Pilate the first time. And the Bible tells us it was early. in John 18:28. And then you have this first trial in Matthew 27:11 and following, Mark 15:1, Luke 23, John 18. And this is one of the places things get really tricky, because really only in the Gospel of Luke is it clear that the trial of Jesus Christ before Pilate is in two phases. Matthew, Mark, and John all just have a trial of Jesus before Pilate. And what those, in the same way we read Isaiah 61, where you have, the blessing of the Messiah and then the day of vengeance, and it's just connected by the word and. That's exactly what you've got in the trial of Christ. And so you really have to do some kind of picayune wordsmithing to figure out, okay, where in Matthew is the break? Where in Mark is the break? Where in John is the break? Where the first part is Christ's first trial before Pilate, and the last part is Christ's last trial before Pilate. Because from the perspective of the writer, it's, look, he was tried before Pilate, so we put the information together. Okay, so it is true. He was tried before Pilate, and they amalgamated the information, so it came out as one big picture. But a lot of people that aren't used to how the biblical authors handle information really become confused. They're like, how come Matthew, Mark, and John just have one trial in front of Pilate, and Luke clearly has two trials in front of Pilate? And the answer is that's just simply the way the biblical writers wrote. They would write about the whole picture unless there was some kind of spiritual need for God to change the way that particular gospel was written and break it into two pieces. And so one thing we see is when Jesus is before Pilate the first time, it was early. And then and that gives them then time to be tried before Pilate, and go to Herod and be tried before Herod, and then go back to Pilate. Now, at this point, I want to share a different thing. I want to share my screen. Oh, now, Rob, you say I can just drag this on top? Oh, that saves a lot of time. Can you all see the picture of Jerusalem?
Yes.
We can.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Great. Thank you. So here's Jesus Christ. Now, the Garden of Gethsemane is somewhere down in here, and we don't really know. Obviously, it's been 2,000 years, and where a person had a garden, we have a hard time finding this. So Christ is arrested down here. Now, this up here is a priestly compound. Still exists today, and I believe that the dungeons underneath the high priest's house, where you can see where Christ and others were imprisoned and sometimes tortured, are still there. So this is the high priest's house. So the first thing that happened is Christ is arrested over here, and and then we don't know, the Bible doesn't tell us whether they would have come through the city, which they might have. At that time of the night, those streets would have been abandoned. So it's not like there would have been crowds in the street. But the other side of the coin is it's completely possible that they avoided the town because they didn't want to run into various people, and they simply walked around the outskirts. By the way, geographically, here's the Mount of Olives up here. This is the Kidron Valley. And this is the Hinnom Valley, where we get Hinnom, the Valley of Hinnom, where they threw the garbage. This long spur right here is the city of David. This was the original Jerusalem of the Jebusites. And then Solomon expanded it up the hill. Then Hezekiah came this way and expanded his wall. There's archaeological remains of that. But Hezekiah expanded it this way. And then through the years, various kings and rulers expanded the city to where we believe that it was approximately like this at the time of Christ. So here Christ is resurrected. Here he's tried by Annas and Caiaphas. This was a high priestly compound. So he would have been tried by both people in this area, both Caiaphas and Annas. And then he would be taken to the temple And the temple had all kinds of rooms in it where, the high courts met and that kind of thing. So he would be taken here. And then he was taken to Pontius Pilate, and there's a lot of disagreement to where Pontius Pilate would have been. The Roman Catholics believe that he would have been here in the Antonia Fortress. Most conservative Christians believe that he would be over here. This is Herod's Western Palace. I think the best research is that Pilate had his residence here, his residence in the army here. This was the old Hasmonean Palace. This was the palace in Jerusalem for the Hasmonean rulers before Herod the Great built this Western Palace. When Herod the Great built this Western Palace, Herod Antipas would have been a boy, and Herod Antipas would have lived in this. This becomes pretty important because after the Sanhedrin tries Christ here in the temple, they would have taken Christ to this palace here, the old Hasmonean Palace. And then when Pilate finds out that Christ is a Galilean, he doesn't want anything to do with him. He wants to send him to Herod Antipas. Herod Antipas would have been staying up here in the Western Palace, which was his childhood home. But one of the pieces of evidence that we believe proves that this is the way things laid out is the Bible in the Greek text. Some of the modern Bibles leave this out, which blows me away. But it's clearly in the Greek text that when Pilate finds out that Jesus Christ is from Galilee, it says Pilate sent Christ up to Herod. And the Greek text uses the word up, or the prefix up. And from here, where the Hasmonean Palace was, to here, and for those of you that have been on the Bible Lands tour with me or with anybody else, that is a pretty significant uphill climb. Now, the word up is also used for when a person of lower authority sends someone to someone of higher authority, like you go from the vice president up to the president. But in this case, Pilate was the representative of the Roman Empire. He was the highest authority in Judea and was much higher in authority than Herod Antipas. So you would never say that Pilate sent Christ up to Herod Antipas, talking about a level of authority. He would have had him down here lower and then sent him geographically up to Herod. Herod then goes to send Christ back down to Pilate. Pilate hands him over to the soldiers who beat him through the night, and then they took him out to the top of the Mount of Olives and crucified him. And I'm getting ahead of myself, but I wanted to show you that picture because that's really helpful. So anyway, so they're at the Last Supper, and then Jesus is sent from Annas to Caiaphas. We saw that's the same priestly compound. Then Jesus is before Caiaphas and Peter's in the courtyard. Then they take Jesus to the whole Sanhedrin in the temple. And then they took Jesus before Pilate the first time, and it was early. Now, the Roman government typically started their day at 6 o'clock in the morning. That was very typical for the Roman government to start at 6 a.m. It was also incredibly typical for the Roman government to quit at 2, because just like the British have tea time, the Romans pretty much had bath time. And much of the upper echelon of the Roman world, about 2 in the afternoon, they knocked off what they were doing and they went to the Roman baths, where there was bathing in the various water, there was games and things to do and business deals to make and that kind of thing. So typically a Roman day was from 6 in the morning until about 2 in the afternoon. So the Bible tells us that when they took Jesus to Pilate the first time, it was early. Now they'd already been met as a Sanhedrin in the temple. So it was early, still could have been 7 a.m. or 7:30. That still would have been considered early. Then, like I said, Pilate sent Jesus before Herod Antipas, and then Herod Antipas sent Jesus before Pilate the second time, and then Jesus was delivered to the Roman soldiers, and they tortured him throughout the night. So this is Tuesday, and they torture Christ through the night until Wednesday morning. And so by Wednesday morning, again, a chronological clue. Oh, and one that I missed, and I wanted to show you this, was a great proof that this is a proper chronology is that John chapter 19, verse 14 says that when Jesus appeared before Pilate, it was about the 6th hour, which is 12 noon. Well, if Christ was arrested on, if we went with a common Good Friday explanation, Christ is arrested on Thursday night and taken to Annas and then Caiaphas and then the Sanhedrin on in the morning, and then to Pilate and then to Herod and then back to Pilate, and then he's crucified at 9:15 in the morning. You had to get all that stuff in before 9:15 in the morning, and it's 9:15 in the morning, but he's not before Pilate the second time until about 12 noon. So, but if he's before Pilate at 12 noon on Tuesday, then he can be crucified about 9 a.m. on Wednesday. And then we know from the gospel records, Christ hung on the cross until 3 p.m. And from, I didn't put this in here, I need to continue to expand this, but from noon until 3, the sky was dark. If you remember, there was darkness over the land. And then in 3 p.m., which was approximately the same time the Passover lamb was being killed in the temple, right across from where Christ was on the top of the Mount of Olives, then he's going to die at 3 p.m. And then Joseph of Arimathea shows up and buries Jesus without spices. And again, this is something the church should have figured out long ago, because it specifically says that Joseph of Arimathea buried Jesus without spices. And all three gospels, the only gospel that doesn't really cover this well is John, and John just has one verse on it. But all the other gospels talk about the process that Joseph went through to get the body of Jesus and then wrap Jesus in a linen cloth. That was it. And no spices. And all three, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, say the women were watching. So the women watched Joseph wrap Jesus in a cloth, bury him in the tomb, and close the tomb door. And then everybody left. And that's why the women said, we need to go buy spices. What they didn't know was that then Nicodemus shows up, and he, let's see, and I need to put this in here because it was really the start of the special Sabbath that Nicodemus showed up with 75 pounds of spices and buried Jesus with the spices. Now, then we get into another reason why there has to be like a Wednesday crucifixion, and then if Christ dies as the Passover lamb, then that's Passover day. The very next day is the beginning of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, which was always a Sabbath. And so we know that from the Old Testament. So we've got, here on Friday, on Thursday, it's a special Sabbath. It's the verses that talk about it being a special Sabbath. So on Thursday, it's a special Sabbath, so everybody has to rest. Friday, the women go and buy spices. Why? Because they watched Joseph bury Jesus without spices. So they go and buy the spices and prepare them. And of course, you can do that on Friday. And this is after the Sabbath, because you had Christ die on Wednesday, You had the special Sabbath on Thursday. And so Mark 16 says that this happened after the Sabbath. They bought spices after the Sabbath, and they did. It was the special Sabbath that was on Thursday. But then you read Luke 23:56, and it says the women bought and prepared the spices before the Sabbath. Well, now which one's right? Is Mark right when it says the women bought and prepared the spices after the Sabbath? Or is Luke right when it says the women bought and prepared the spices after the Sabbath, or I mean, before the Sabbath? And the answer is they're both right, because the women bought the spices after the regular, after the special Sabbath, but before the weekly Sabbath. And so if we know the chronology, instead of saying, well, Mark and Luke, they just got the details wrong, you read the commentaries, well, they got the details wrong. If we understand the chronology, it fits perfectly. And that's what we want to look for in the Word of God, things that fit together perfectly. So it's before the regular weekly Sabbath on Saturday, after the special Sabbath. But then why didn't the women take the spices to the tomb on Friday? Because they knew that there was a Roman guard. And I didn't include that in here, and that's more of the detail that I need to put in here, is that Mary Magdalene went with another woman on Friday night to look at the tomb, and they saw that you couldn't get into it because of the Roman guard that was there. So then that's Friday. The next day is Saturday, and Jesus gets up from the grave just before sunset on Saturday. So he was buried just before sunset on Wednesday, to just before sunset on Thursday is day one, on Friday is day two, just before sunset on Saturday is day three. So Jesus got up from the grave, not in the dark, but just before sunset, which also then fits the prophecy that he would arise the third day, because he got up during the day, not after sunset, in the night. And all that's recorded in Matthew chapter 12, verse 40, that Jesus would be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. And of course, that's problematic for the church, because you can't get 3 nights and 3 days and 3 nights from Friday, when Christ would have been buried, to Sunday morning while it's still dark. Now, this is an interesting truth as well. So Jesus Christ got up on the evening of the 17th of Nisan, the evening of the 17th of that month. If you go back and you look at Genesis chapter 8, verse 4, and if you understand the chronology, that's the same month and day that Noah's Ark rested on the land and humankind was safe from the flood. So humankind was safe from the flood and certain death in the water on the same month and day that Jesus Christ was raised from the dead and humankind is saved from death. And then we have Nisan 18, Sunday, and you have the resurrection appearances that occurred on Sunday first. And again, I've got to do some fill in to get these scriptures, but first he appeared to Mary Magdalene. Then he met with the women who were coming to the tomb with spices. Then he met with the men on the road to Emmaus. Then he appeared to Peter alone. And then he appeared to all of the apostles except Thomas behind closed doors. And if we can put this together, this is then a very cogent picture of what happened to Jesus Christ in the last week of his life. And if we have this framework and we want to take time, then we go back and we plug this in and we read these scriptures, and you can see the whole picture of the last, say 10 days or so of Christ's life come together. And it's a beautiful, wonderful picture. And I realize it's not a super simple teaching. And, sometimes you teach a real impactful, super simple teaching with a kind of a rah, rah, rah. And that this kind of teaching is not that, but this is the kind of teaching that we can have confidence. Why do I trust the Word of God? Because of stuff like this, that you have 4 gospels written by 4 different people over a period of years, and the details fit together completely, and they fit with the prophecies in the Old Testament, and they fit with customs, and they fit with Roman history. And this is the kind of thing that a historian would look at and go, wow, the accuracy in this is absolutely astounding. So that's what I wanted to share tonight. And I will commit to the fact that I will take some time here in the next couple weeks and fill this out. And then it will end up inside some commentary somewhere that we can anchor to other commentaries so people can find it.